Hi friends, Mike Gillaspia here in our 3 News digital studio on this, the day after Election Day, a busy day for a whole lot of folks, and as elections go, maybe a surprising day for some folks. And that's kind of the nature of elections. You look at, you predict, you guess, you speculate, you think you know what's going to happen, and then some cases maybe it does. In other cases, well, you walk away saying, didn't see that one coming. So there's a lot of that happened in the election. Hopefully you were with us for our election night coverage on 3 News Plus. We spent 3 hours online looking at the races live as the numbers were coming in. And what we want to do today is we want to spend a little bit of time looking again at some of those races. Some of those have been decided and we know about those. Others, of course, could be headed to runoffs. And remember, this is just barely the day after, and so there are still some votes even being counted in some of those races. I want to bring in the guy who's going to help us here for the next little bit. This is Travis Braidwood, familiar to our Channel 3 viewers, is Associate Professor of Political Science there at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, and we are always happy to have his expertise whenever we talk about things of a political nature. So Travis, let me begin by saying welcome and thank you for your time this morning.
It's good to talk to you.
Let's do this. We want to jump right into the races here in a bit, but before we do that, I want to talk about trends. What did you see overall in terms of voting, in terms of voter turnout, in terms of choices that were made on election night?
Well, at the national level, we saw some really interesting trends that we're going to have to keep an eye on into future elections, and that is we're seeing a lot more of a gender divide. We're not really sure if that was just because of Harris being on the ticket. We saw for the first time in some key battleground states like Pennsylvania, the divide for Latino men breaking for Republicans were the highest we've ever seen in history. In fact, we're talking, in the case of Pennsylvania, double-digit male Latino voters going for Trump, and that was also much more unexpected. Typically, Democrats tend to have a little bit of a wider margin for Latino voters, and we're curious if that's going to go away. And then, of course, the economy was one of the major driving factors. So if you look at some of the areas that had largest economic downturns or had large amounts of unemployment, those tended to break more for Republicans than their Democratic counterparts.
And wouldn't you say, I mean, isn't it true that when people feel like the economy is not working in their favor, that really becomes maybe the #1 decision in how they vote? It seemed that way in some races, and I guess on a presidential level, that had to be the big one, right?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and that is, it doesn't even necessarily have to be purely tied into reality or changes in the marketplace. For example, the stock market, even before the election, was higher than we'd seen in a while. Inflation had begun to go down. Unemployment's really low, but the perception of the economy is what drives people. And so, for both Democrats and Republicans, they were citing the economy as top 1 or top 2 issue. And so that can still motivate people, based on the feelings of what the economy looks like or what it is doing.
Let's talk about then some of the big races. Obviously, the biggest race, a presidential year, and so we had the presidential race, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris. This was unusual for a whole lot of reasons. Number one, the late hour at which Kamala became the nominee of the Democratic Party. How much do you think that played into this?
Probably pretty significant. She got sort of the worst of both situations, one being that she wasn't as well known, even though she had been vice president for the preceding years. She didn't have that spotlight. And then the other is she was attached to the Biden administration, which was already unpopular because of views on the economy. And so she got stuck with both the lack of the name recognition, not a lot of time to get people to know her that well, and then simultaneously getting attached to the Biden administration in any of its failures, but none of its benefits.
And yet, in spite of those things, there was still a lot of hope, at least among Democrats. And, we even saw a big turnout of Republicans saying that, hey, for the first time, I'm voting for the Democrat. And that was more about, I guess, their displeasure with Donald Trump than anything else. I thought that might have a bigger impact in this race. What did you see?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are expecting that simply because if you look at Trump's numbers, even when he was in office and all the way up through his, the past administration, they've always been underwater. There's been higher disapproves than approves. But then what we also saw is that Kamala Harris, although she started out pretty strong when she emerged on the scene, her numbers started tapering off as well. And so what a lot of people were looking at is which of these two candidates is the one I dislike the least, or which one of these things will I feel the least uncomfortable with it getting elected. And so, in many cases, a lot of voters were simply frustrated with their options of choices.
Let's talk about some of the races here in Texas. As we mentioned last night, and as has been true for a while, Texas obviously a red state. Didn't do a whole lot to change that in last night's election. But the big one that people were watching that, again, some folks thought might be a little closer than it ended up being was the race between Ted Cruz and Colin Allred for U.S. Senator. Going into the election, we were talking about Colin Allred being the challenger who's within the margin of error and looking like this could be the time that Ted Cruz is unseated. That did not happen. What did you see in that race?
Yeah, I think you're right. Some of these polls, even at the very end, had them at a 50-50 tie, or in some cases, you had a 3 to 4 point vote lead for Cruz. But when we look at the numbers, at least now, I mean, there's still a few outstanding votes there. It still looks like now Cruz pretty safely coasted to a victory. And so what we have to be asking is, one, are we not getting respondents to people that are likely voters? Are we getting too much of just an opinion assessment rather than who's actually turning out? And then also, of course, we had the last minute blitzes from both candidates in terms of advertising. And I don't know about you, but I felt pretty inundated with the All Red Cruise ads. I felt like every other time I turned on television, I was seeing one of those. So that might have given people that final push to remind them about this upcoming election.
Yeah, I think between the ads and the text messages, there are probably not a whole lot of people who are sad that part of this process is over. Those did seem to be more prevalent this year, and again, they did seem to strike a certain tone for particular candidates. Let me ask you this because you mentioned something interesting here. Is the way that we go out ahead of time to try to determine, who we think is going to win or how close these races might be? Are we still being effective in how we do that, or is that something that's going to have to take a relook at some point?
Well, for a while we have had a problem in the past, maybe like 10 or so years, of trying to get enough Republican conservative respondents in surveys. There tends to be a lower response rate. And so we can try and account for that. But still, oftentimes we have these polls, they tend to be skewed, at least for some reason or another. In the past elections, for example, with Trump when he was running back in 2016, education used to be a virtually unimportant variable, looking at if we're getting an accurate sample. Now education has become much more important. Democrats tend to get more college educated voters, Republicans more not. And so this is one of the things you're constantly having to update to see if we're actually getting that sample. But if you look at the states if you looked at the battleground map nationally for the president, for example, all those states that we're looking at would be close. We're close. We're talking within a margin of 3-4%, and that's kind of what some of these things we're expecting. There wasn't really any that completely blew us away from the early polling to the actual outcome.
So a lot of what we were looking at, a lot of what we expected held accurate in a lot of these cases, right?
Yeah, for the most part. For the most part. I mean, there's some like we were talking with Cruz, where those polls, for the most part, seem to be actually quite wrong, right?
Yeah, and that's going to happen, and you're going to have anomalies, I guess, in any election year. Again, not a perfect science here, but fairly accurate in what we're doing. Let me move to some of these other races. Governor Abbott spent a lot of time here in Corpus Christi over the last couple of weeks, especially trying to prop up some candidates and really campaigning for them, and even going so far as to saying these are the folks I need in order to get the job done that I want to get done. Now, I'm assuming here that he's talking about school vouchers. I think that's probably going to be one of his #1 priorities going into the new legislative session. Are you sensing that?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, because if you look at our district, for example, for the U.S. House, that one seemed pretty solidly in Michael Cloud's box there. But if you look at for the Texas Senate in particular, Texas House, where they're having this close dispute for some rural members of the Texas Republican Party not wanting to endorse the voucher system that Abbott's proposing because they think it's going to lead to detriment for those school systems, those rural school systems, you can see that's exactly where he was going, and that is areas that have maybe moderate to rural populations, and then trying to peel off those seats for people that are not as loyal to his voucher agenda.
How much of a help do you think that was for someone like Adam Hinojosa, State Senator, District 27, in his contest with Senator Morgan Lamantia? Do you think Republicans were just going to vote Republican, or do you think the push by Governor Abbott really kind of elevated him?
Yeah, that's hard to say for those really local races because you look at the numbers, they're kind of small. And so it probably had an effect, but it was probably at the margins. I think, if anything, it might have been just the motivating factor of some of the up ballot elections. So when you're looking at the fact that Cruz was up for re-election, the fact that you had Trump and Harris going on for that, that you might have had some of these people also then giving the down ballot local races an extra boost, particularly for states like Texas.
I think, you're looking at the same thing when you're talking about State Representative District 34. You mentioned that a moment ago. That is the Republican Denise Villalobos defeating Solomon Ortiz Jr. This was another one going into it where you would think that the candidate with the name recognition, Solomon Ortiz, might have the advantage here, and yet it turned out to be something that it looks like Villalobos has won by a much wider margin than people were expecting. What do you see?
Yeah, I noticed that trend, and I also noticed that a lot of the incumbent name recognition really carried over for some of these elections, particularly more local ones. And so, if you look at, for example, our city council elections, or you look at some of these other smaller, office positions, that a lot of these incumbents were getting reelected at a pretty high rate, particularly in our local area for Republican candidates. And I think that that's perhaps what's driving a lot of these races, these smaller election races.
And these victories, I mean, this obviously bodes well for Republicans. I mean, what do you think they can do, having secured some of these?
Well, I think we'll have to see the final total count for both the House and the Senate. But if anything, it bodes for Texas House and Senate. But if anything, it bodes well for Abbott's agenda, right? It seems like he now has got enough new allies in both chambers that might be able to push something where he is advancing policy things. As we talked about the example of trying to do vouchers, where now we're going to see more party loyalty, particularly towards the governor's agenda itself.
Yeah, and that will play out big. Again, we do have, hard to believe, but we've got another legislative session coming up in January. And, people are thinking, didn't we just do that? But we'll remind folks that, the governor kept calling those special sessions. So the last one went for almost a year?
Yeah, exactly. So since we only meet every other year, we as Texans are just used to saying, okay, now I have this break off, or I'm not going to hear this constant bombardment. But you're right, we kept seeing Abbott wanting to get things on the agenda that, particularly the House was not wanting to take up, or they just didn't think they'd have enough votes. And then rather than just let it go, kept calling special session after special session over and over and over again, as is his prerogative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he did what the law certainly allows him to do, and I know he was really pushing some things. Some things he got. I mean, the property tax thing and things like that. Other things he worked on that didn't happen that you suspect, as we mentioned, school vouchers will come up again in this legislative session. Let me jump over to the race for district attorney. That was a fascinating one here. Jimmy Granberry was put in that position after Mark Gonzalez decided to leave that spot. So I'm wondering if that gave him any advantage over his opponent here in the race, Terry Shamsey, by having already been in that position, having already served. Do you think that was a help, or did it not really matter much here?
Yeah, it's when you have those appointments like that, and you have people that they don't have as long as that name recognition time frame. They do have a bit of an uphill challenge, but the fact that you can claim anything, any sort of credit claiming, any sort of name recognition that goes with that, there is measurable distance and difference. And even when you're talking at the margins, just even if it's only a 1 to 2% increase in name recognition, that can, in these smaller races, these local races, that can matter because, as you'll notice, if you look at just the raw numbers of votes cast for some of these local races versus comparing it to like Michael Cloud or Donald Trump, the number is a lot smaller because a lot of people have voter roll off. They simply skip the question because they don't know enough about it. And so then you can have these small victories lead, small changes in big victories.
That's an interesting point because I had not thought about that people will get to places maybe on the ballot or things that, boy, that's a lot of reading I'm going to have to do, or I don't really understand that, or I don't know either of the candidates in this particular race. And so maybe they just pick one randomly or, like you said, skip over it entirely.
Yeah, if you look at the city council, you can see that as well. Since we have so many candidates that were running, you could see if you compare that to some of the other races, just the sheer number of votes cast dramatically falls off.
Let me jump to the county commissioner. I mean, I don't know that there's a big surprise here, but Mike Pusley, a former county commissioner, a current city councilman, wanted to get back with county commissioners. Looked like he wins pretty handily in Precinct 1. John Mares also wanted to continue on in Precinct 3. His was a little closer than maybe a lot of folks thought it might be. What did you see?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think as we said before, a lot of these things just come down often to just incumbency advantage. One of the things I was noticing is looking at their election returns, following my eye down, is if you look for that asterisk indicating who is that incumbent, I was often seeing star, asterisk check, and you're seeing a lot of these incumbents get maintain those seats. And again, this often just comes down to just pure name recognition because some of these cases they've been there for multiple years, and that way they also are the ones that when you see a lot of those yard signs, it's oftentimes the incumbents are the ones putting those up. And again, it might only have a small effect, but that's enough to tip you over the small threshold in these local ones.
And it's not just the name recognition that comes with the incumbent, but let me ask you this, because I have heard a lot of people say, boy, where you are on the ballot really does have an effect and really does matter. Is that necessarily true?
Yeah, there is research on this for locations, particularly for names when you have multiple candidates, local races, especially on the ballot. This is called a primacy effect, where that name is selected more often than those down ballot. And then there's also a slight boost for those at the very bottom for multiple names, which is called a recency effect. So you can get a little bit of an inflated factor there. There's efforts to try and randomize where the names are on the ballot, but most states will still have the same list of the names. So wherever you got stuck, top or bottom, that's pretty much where you are. It's not like every ballot is randomized, just the original order of the names is.
Yeah, absolutely there. So let me do this. We have, it looks like in our mayor and city council races, we have some of those races that appear that they're going to be going to a runoff. The biggest there notably is in the race for mayor. It looks as though the incumbent, Mayor Paulette Guajardo, was close to that 50% threshold, but did not manage to quite get there. And of course, that puts her in a runoff, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was a bit surprised at that one too. I thought it wouldn't be as close as it was, but it could also be the fact that we had multiple candidates down there, and even though some of these other candidates didn't get nearly enough, you're talking about like a siphoning effect, where normally if we just had maybe 2, 3 candidates, it probably would have been pretty clear cut. But the fact that you have some of these, even if they weren't that serious of a challenger, that's what can often lead to these runoffs that we're going to have happen.
And that's what happened here. And of course, folks know that in the mayor, in the single district races here for city council, you've got to get, at least 50% of the vote. And if you don't, then you and whoever the next highest person was, no matter what they got, that's where the runoff is, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's also, if you're looking to have a really big influence on local politics, that's the election to show out for, because those runoff elections, tend to have really, really low voter turnout. And so if you can get some of your friends together and convince them to go, turn out to the polls, just a small number of people will have a disproportionate impact on choosing those candidates.
Yeah, and one of the things we're going to see this year, I was talking with the city secretary here in Corpus Christi. I believe this year the runoff election date is like December, I think the 14th, which is a Saturday. And we were trying to think back of when we've seen a runoff election on a Saturday. Saturdays, I don't know, is that a good or a bad day for folks to get out and vote? If you're already talking about a type of election that has low voter turnout, how does Saturday impact that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it can be beneficial depending on, I guess, the candidate. But for a lot of countries, particularly like European countries, they have theirs on a weekend, or they'll make their voting day a national holiday. But you're right. I mean, when you're talking about a Saturday late in December, you also might be running into like the holiday season where people might be traveling. So you run into the problem of reminding people about the election because they'll often forget, and then also getting them to take the time off on their, might be their day off, to show up to a polling place.
And again, all of that will have to be decided after the city council officially canvasses the election. I think that's coming up on November the 19th. That's when a runoff will be declared, and that's when people will start talking about early voting and getting out and voting in any runoff election. Let me go beyond the mayor's race, though. I was intrigued. Now, there's not a runoff here because they treat the at-large city council a little bit different than the single-member districts, but there were a lot of folks, I think at least 10 folks running for 3 at-large spots. 2 of the incumbents were not going to be there again. Mike Pusley running for county commissioner. Michael Hunter had termed out and of course was running for mayor. That left Jim Klein is the only incumbent in that race, and it does not appear that he's going to be able to hold on to that seat. The names that have popped up, though, are familiar names of people who have been there before, in Carolyn Vaughn and Mark Scott, and of course Roland Barrera, current District 3 council member, who decided that he wanted to give a shot there at large. Did that shake out about like you thought it might?
I was a bit surprised too to not see Klein come back in there, but that one again, I was also a little bit. It was hard for me to even gauge where this was going to go with so many candidates on that list. And then also, it's oftentimes harder for these people trying to vote in these local elections to get enough information about the candidates to make these really informed decisions. And again, as we just said a little while ago, you also notice big drop-offs in terms of vote totals for that election. So you could see there's a lot of, it looked like almost a lot of uncertainty in terms of the voting bits there. But you could see the distributions was kind of spread out over these candidates. And like there was, a clear, let's say like front runner out of the listings.
Yeah, an interesting point there I think you make. Of course, a couple of other council districts that look like they're headed to runoffs. District 1, Everett Roy and Billy Lerma, they have both been in that spot kind of back and forth, and it looks like, again, voters will have to go to another election to decide between those two. And in District 4, where Dan Suckley chose not to run again, and that kind of left District 4 wide open, and it looks like Kaylin Paxson and May Mendoza are the 2 people there. Anything surprise you out of those 2 races?
No, not in particular. Again, with those local ones, it's often really hard because we don't have any polling data, and so the only thing we typically would look to is to say, okay, has a candidate suffered some sort of catastrophe like a scandal, or is it an open seat? Is there no incumbent running? In which case, it's going to open up the field to more variation, and then you can also try and get a gauge for the amount of advertising that they're doing, but that's usually in the local form, so it might be something like yard signs, but that's a poor assessment of in voter enthusiasm for particular candidates. So oftentimes these things come as just complete surprises, barring some sort of abnormality.
And we should go ahead and just mention here that there are a couple of incumbents who are returning to the same spots that they held. Sylvia Campos in District 2 defeating Ben Molina, who had that position previously, and then Gil Hernandez defeating David Pena in District 5. They will be returning. Eric Cantu will be new to the City Council. Again, when Roland Barrera decided to run for an at-large seat, that opened up District 3, and Eric Cantu, I believe, won pretty handily there. Are you seeing anything in what, as it looks like what the makeup is going to be of the City Council? Are you seeing any of the City Council agenda items, the things that they have been pushing for over the last 2 years? Do you see any of those being in jeopardy or perhaps changing with what it appears that the makeup will be here?
Well, I think what a lot of people are interested in is looking at, of course, the new desalination plan and the positions on that. That one's going to be there. There was also that commission that was created to look at certain types of books in libraries and whether that thing was ultimately dismissed in the candidate positions there. I think that I think probably desal is going to be the big thing that people are going to keep an eye on and see how that's shaken out in terms of the candidate positions for that moving forward, that particular project, and how controversial it is.
Yeah, certainly a lot of eyes are going to be on that. I want to kind of broach one more topic here with you. And again, this may have been a surprise, but for several years now, every other year, the Corpus Christi School District has put out a school bond. They have been busy building new schools, consolidating schools, upgrading equipment, upgrading security. And every other year for several years now, that bond has passed. This year, it not only fell, it appears that it fell pretty handily. I'm wondering, is there a voter fatigue that comes with this sort of thing, or was there something else in play here?
I was also really curious about that because there was a number of propositions dealing with roads and recreational areas. All of those passed, at least I'm pretty sure they all passed, and they passed it with a pretty decent margin in most cases. Not surprisingly, when Corpus Christi citizens hear bond initiative or ballot measures and propositions about road repair, we suddenly jump at the chance. But I was surprised at the defeat rate too, because I think it was over 60% for that spending there. And I think you might be right. I think it either came down to fatigue and saying we're constantly sick of having to pay for this. I think it also might have been a question of wording in the proposition. So basically directly reminding people that you will have to pay for this, and that this will raise, the revenue has to come from somewhere. I think that maybe the language might have turned people off. Also, by the time they got to that proposition, after they did 6, and then they get to this one, there's also some voter fatigue. I know when I was voting, I was looking over at people's, and they were getting hunchbacks from staring at the screens for so long, reading these giant proposition languages that they, in some cases, never had read before.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a lot of that with the Corpus Christi City, props that people were having to go through. And you're right, those did pass. But when you got to the school district one, there was a big number of folks there who said, absolutely not. I think we're done with this. Anything else that you saw overall in this election, either on a local or a national level, that you think is at least worth noting here?
No, I think we covered pretty much everything. I think that for some of these races that we saw at the larger scales, like Texas House, Texas Senate, our U.S. House seats, we all basically just saw those coming. And then like you were saying, the local races are the ones that are more interesting because we get a bit more surprise, a little bit more variation. And then also you're going to have that chance to, if you really want to have an influence on the election going forward, those runoff races are going to be dependent on just a small number of voters. So don't forget that it's coming up.
Absolutely. Another chance to go out and vote. And of course, we here at KIII will let you know about all of that and keep you informed on the details so that you can go out and do that all over again. Professor Braidwood, thank you again for your time. We always appreciate getting to talk with you.
Of course. Thank you.
All right, and we want to remind folks that you can stay with us for the latest on KIII. Of course, you can join us at 5, 6, and 10, and again for our first edition that begins at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we'll continue to bring you the most updated results from this election. For now, signing off from our 3 News Digital Studio, Mike Gillaspia. Thanks for watching.